Alright, now it's time for us to install and configure Azure AD Connect. Before we start, there are some prerequisites that are needed in order for us to deploy and configure Azure AD Connect. First and foremost, we need an on-premise Active Directory. It could be a physical server that you have in your lab environment or a VM. We will be using a virtual machine on this demo. It's going to be in Azure, to be specific. You're going to need a custom domain name for your Active Directory on-prem. So for this case, I'm going to be using my own custom domain, and it's already set on the domain controller in where my Active Directory is. We're going to need also an Azure AD account with Global Administrator role. This is required during the setup. Yeah, so those are the three main things that you need in order to install and configure Azure AD Connect. The tasks that we're going to be doing are, of course, configure AD Connect and do a sync. That's the user sync for this demo. Enable and configure password hash sync, enable and configure password pass-through authentication, and then last but not the least, password write back. Okay, so let's now jump into our Azure portal. Okay, here we are now in the Azure portal. So first thing we need to do is go to the Azure Active Directory window here, and then on the left pane you're gonna see Azure AD Connect. So click on that, and as you could see, there's nothing enabled at the moment. It's saying password hash sync enabled, but it's actually not syncing to anything at the moment. So now go on and download that installer file and download. Right, that it's downloaded, go to your server and install it. Okay, so here we are now in our test server. It have which is now set up with Azure AD Domain Services. As if we go to Azure on Active Directory, I have now created a new organizational unit. It's called AZ users, and I've created a test user and a test group. Okay, so now once you copied that Azure AD Connect installer file, I have it now here. I'm just gonna double click that to install. Okay, that's pretty quick. Agree to the license terms and privacy notice. You can read that if you want to, but I'll just proceed. Click on continue. Now it will then prompt you for express settings. Just use express setting for now. Then you will now be able to log in to your or authenticate to your Azure AD. Now what you need here is an Azure AD account with a global administrator as per the prerequisite that I've said earlier. So I'm just gonna enter that account here. Okay, now that we're logged in, it will now then prompt you for your Active Directory Domain Services Administrator credentials. So this is now your on-prem AD Administrator credential. So I'm just gonna type that in. Next, it will then go to the next steps, which will perform all these listed tasks here. It will actually enable password hash synchronization by default, and the synchronization engine will start once it's installed. So you also got this tick box here that you can uncheck if you don't want the synchronization process to start after it installs. So I'm just going to leave that check and click on install. So while waiting, I'm going to show you where you have to enter the custom domain for this. Now in your Azure Active Directory portal, go to your custom domain names on your left. Here is where you can add your on-premise Active Directory custom domain. Make sure it's registered to a domain name provider. Just click on Add Custom Domain. Let's say here, whatever domain name, just for testing purposes. So when you add that, Azure will give you these records that you need to enter on the DNS settings on your custom domain. Also make sure you have access to your domain name provider account so you can set these tax records. I'm just gonna delete that because I don't need that. Delete that. Now it's also installing the Azure AD Connect Health agent. It's part of this Azure AD Connect main component. Right, so we now have the configuration complete. You're gonna have some error messages here. The orange are more likely a warning. Green are the successful tasks that been done by the configuration, and you have some recommendations here as well that you can actually look. Now just click on exit on that, and as you could see, it's created an icon on the desktop on our domain controller. Just double click on that. Right. Now, so once it's installed, it does configure, the fundamental features that it have. But you can configure it further by going to Azure AD Connect and click on Configure. Pay attention to this message. It's saying that the sync service will be suspended while you have this wizard open, and it will resume once you close it. So take note of that. Now click on Configure. In order for us to start synchronizing our users, by default, Azure AD Connect, it synchronizes everything in your Active Directory. But if you want to customize that, go to the Customize Synchronization options. As you can see here, click on Next. You have to authenticate again. Okay, so that's already set there. Do not change that unless you need to. Now, what we actually need here is the domain/OU filtering. Currently, it's syncing all domains and OUs. Now, if you want to customize that, just select the sync selected domains and OUs. What I need to do here is I'm just going to uncheck everything and just select that specific OU where our test user and the group is located. Now I'm just going to next to that. So as you could see here, we have password hash sync enabled. Now as one of our tasks, I'm going to enable password write back as well. So it's just a tick box. So just click next. Again, it will start the synchronization process once you click on configure or OK. You can disable that if you want to, but I'm just gonna leave it as it is. Configure. Okay, configuration complete. Let's exit there. Now let's check our Azure AD. Okay, so I'm now back in the Azure AD portal. So let's check the user. There we go. So by default, it creates a service account in your Azure AD. So don't touch that account, leave it as it is. Don't delete it. Now, as you could see here, we now have our test user synchronized from on-prem AD to Azure AD. It actually happened real quick. It will depend on how many users are being synced or how large is your, how large the directory is, the on-prem directory. So as you could see on this user account, there is a what you call here. So if you go edit, you can't change the name. It's all grayed out. That means it's syncing those information from on-prem AD. So if you want to change the name, you have to change it in on-prem AD. So another thing you've noticed here, so if you go back to that user, is the reset password. Now if we reset the password here, since we have the password write back set, it will write back the password to on-prem AD instantly, like zero delay. Now let's check the group that we have tried to sync. There you go. So the name is on-premise office group, and as you could see in the source column, it's sourced from Windows Server AD, which is the on-prem AD. There you go. So you now have your Azure AD Connect configured. It's just, I think it's a bug. It's still saying sync has never run, but it should just refresh itself in a period of time. I'm not going to worry about that because we've already seen that it's synchronized the users that we have in our on-prem AD. So how about pass-through authentication? In order to enable that, we have to go back to our AD Connect server, sync server. In this case, it's a domain controller. Open up Azure AD Connect console, however you want to name this. Select configure, and under additional tasks, select change user sign in. Next on that, log in with your Azure AD admin account. Okay, so once you're logged in or authenticated, you're gonna have an option here. So when you change the setting, the sign-in method here to pass-through authentication, you are only allowed to select one So that means it will disable the password hash synchronization. Now, if you also want to enable in single sign-on, there's a tick box here for that. So let's select that, pass-through authentication, and click next. It will then prompt you for the domain administrator account to configure your on-prem forest for use in the single sign-on. So I'm just going to enter credentials. Okay, once you have entered your domain administrator account, just click next, and it will then configure your pass-through authentication and single sign-on. So again, you got that synchronization process to start. Once you click configure, leave it as it is, and configure. There you have it, pass-through authentication. Alright, so we have set up our Azure AD Connect on a domain controller, which is a VM. We have checked the custom domain names, and we have showed you how to use the global admin Azure AD account in order to set up Azure AD Connect. We have started the synchronization. We have seen how to enable these two authentication methods and the password right back. So thank you for watching, and see you on the next one.